Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Mian Oh, Director of the Atlantic Council's Asia Security Initiative, housed within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's event on Defending Democracy Worldwide, Strengthening Taiwan's Democratic Resilience, which is part of the Asia Security Initiative ongoing project with the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office, TECRO, in the United States. And I'm really delighted to be opening today's event, which will explore how the United States and its allies and partners can work with Taiwan to ensure that it remains a vibrant and prosperous democracy moving forward. The mission of Asia Security Initiative program is to help the United States better work with Asian allies and partners in responding to the rise of China. Its mission is also to translate US policy objectives and strategic aims into nuanced messages to Asian stakeholders that incorporate Indo-Pacific voices in order to foster a community of like-minded nations committed to adapting and revitalizing the rules-based international order. We're also excited to be hosting this event alongside the Atlantic Council's new Global China Hub, which devises ally solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise, leveraging and amplifying Atlantic Council's work on China across its other centers and programs. As this group knows well, today, President Biden is hosting the inaugural Summit for Democracy, which brings together leaders from government, civil society, and the private sector under three principal themes: defending against authoritarianism, fighting corruption, and promoting respect for human rights worldwide. Preserving Taiwan's existence as a free and open democracy is critical for upholding the rules-based international order. And Taiwan's participation at the Summit for Democracy underlines Washington's effort to raise the island nation's profile as a bulwark against Beijing's effort against democracies worldwide. Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen has stated in a recent Foreign Affairs op-ed, as you may know, that, quote, if Taiwan were to fall, the consequences would be catastrophic for regional peace and the democratic alliance system. It would be signaled that in today's global context of values, authoritarianism has the upper hand over democracy, quote. Therefore, today's discussion comes at an especially important time as we continue our effort to develop concrete actionable policy recommendation for a coordinated response to China's rise with US allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. As a reminder, today's event is open to the public and on the record. Our audience members joining through Zoom can submit their questions at any time using the Q&A function. And towards the end of the session, our moderator will raise any relevant questions to our panelists. We are very fortunate today to be joined by a fantastic panel with deep expertise on Taiwan, Indo-Pacific affairs, China's foreign policy, and cross-strait relations. And I'm really eager to join into the discussion to hear their insights into this timely and important topic. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Lin Li, who is the Associate Director for Asia at the National Endowment for Democracy, where she oversees the grant portfolio for democracy and human rights programs in East Asia. Prior to joining the endowment, Dr. Li was a senior project manager at Intermedia, where she managed research projects for major media organizations that broadcast radio and TV programming to Asia, such as Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, and the BBC. Dr. Li also carried out a 2-year evaluation of US State Department funded international NGOs working on the rule of law, civil society support, labor rights, and free access to information in China. So Lin, great to have you. The floor is to you. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mian, for your introduction. And I want to thank the Atlantic Council and TECRA for inviting me to moderate this panel with 3 distinguished speakers to talk about how the US and its allies and partners can work more closely with Taiwan to strengthen its democratic resilience, as well as how Taiwan can play an important role in reasserting democratic norms and values globally. As Mia mentioned, today leaders of democratic governments, civil society, and private sector have gathered virtually at the Summit for Democracy to discuss defending against authoritarianism, fighting corruption, and promoting respect for human rights around the world. And the summit's three themes are all inextricably linked, and there's no other country that understands this linkage better than Taiwan. And we're glad to see that Taiwan is invited to the Summit for Democracy to share its democratization experiences and demonstrate its commitment to democratic ideals and values, despite Beijing's persistent attempt to undermine and destabilize its democracy. The successful democratization of Taiwan shows the world how authoritarianism can be rolled back and a country can peacefully transition to liberal democracy. In fact, Taiwan is transforming into a vibrant hub for regional and international civil society organizations, and its civil society actors are becoming regional and global leaders on countering disinformation and defending the information space, as well as promoting civic tech and democracy. As a case in point, Taiwan's digital minister, Audrey Tang, will be speaking at the summit tomorrow on countering digital authoritarianism and affirming democratic values. And I hope the summit will provide an opportunity for democratic governments and Democrats around the world to recognize and embrace that, as Mian said earlier, Taiwan's continued existence as a democracy serves as a regional anchor of stability, and that Taiwan's democratic resilience is key to maintaining the liberal international order. So in this context, today's panel speakers will aim to address the following set of questions. What role does Taiwan play in the global struggle between democracy and authoritarianism? What lessons does Taiwan's democratic resilience have for people, like-minded democracies throughout the world? In what areas can the US and its allies and partners work together with Taiwan to strengthen its democratic institutions in the face of Beijing's coercion efforts? And likewise, in what ways can Taiwan and its allies and partners advance democratic principles and digital democracy? And ultimately, what steps can the US and other democracies throughout the world take to ensure that Taiwan remains a vibrant and prosperous democracy? Now, each of the panelists will try to address some or all of these questions in their opening remarks, and we'll have more discussion later. Now, let me introduce our panelists for today. We have with us Ambassador Nathan Sales, non-resident senior fellow for the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, and who was also the former acting undersecretary for civilian security, democracy, and human rights at the US Department of State. Our second panelist is Dr. Karis Templeman, who is a research fellow and who belongs to the project on Taiwan and Indo-Pacific at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. And our third panelist is Dr. David Shulman, who is the Senior Director of Global China Hub here at the Atlantic Council. Each panelist will have about 5 to 7 minutes for their opening remarks. And we will start with Ambassador Sales, followed by Dr. Templeman and Dr. Shulman. Now, let me turn the floor over to Ambassador Sales. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Lynn, and thanks to everyone who's joining us virtually for this very important conversation. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'll keep my opening remarks brief so that we can move straight away into back and forth and questions and answers. I'd like to discuss 3 main points today. First of all, why Taiwan matters, and then second and third, some of the diplomatic and assistance measures that the United States and like-minded countries can take to help reinforce Taiwanese democracy against the various threats it faces. Let me start with the most important question of all, why Taiwan matters. And that's a complex question that can be broken down based on different perspectives. Why does Taiwan matter so much to the Chinese Communist Party and to General Secretary Xi Jinping? Why don't we start there? It's not just, in my mind, a continuation of the conflict in the 1940s. It's not just that General Secretary Xi seeks a final settlement of the Civil War from the 1940s. something more fundamental is at work here, and it is that Taiwan really represents a fundamental challenge to the ideology that justifies the Chinese Communist Party's rule. It is indeed an existential ideological threat. Taiwan's mere existence and prosperity is an existential ideological threat to the governing ideology of the CCP. In essence, the Chinese Communist Party's claim to legitimacy is performance. The CCP, through its 5-year plans and through its wise statesmen, as the story goes, will lift the Chinese people out of poverty and geopolitical irrelevance to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The trade is basically prosperity for autocracy. You can't have one without the other, according to Beijing's telling. Well, Taiwan shows that that claim is completely and utterly false. The great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation has already been achieved, and it was not achieved in Beijing, it was achieved in Taipei. It was not achieved because an autocratic government created 5-year plans. It was achieved through liberal democracy, through democratic elections in which people are able to vote their preferences and hold accountable the officials who govern in their name. It was achieved through the free market, which mobilizes the ingenuity and innovation of private citizens. It was achieved through respect for human rights and the rule of law. In short, Taiwan is prosperous, and Taiwan is a beacon precisely because it has embraced the liberal and democratic values that we in the United States celebrate, and that our European partners celebrate, and that other like-minded countries around the world celebrate. And that is, for Xi Jinping, intolerable. It simply is unacceptable for the CCP for Taiwan to continue to give the lie to the Communist Party's propaganda that autocracy and authoritarianism and an Orwellian surveillance state are necessary in order to achieve prosperity. Taiwan has achieved all of those things by following the path of Western liberal democracy. Second point I would like to discuss is some of the diplomatic steps that the United States and like-minded nations can take to reinforce Taiwanese democracy. At one level, these sorts of measures take place through bilateral channels. And so the United States can and should continue to do whatever it can to strengthen the bilateral relationships between the United States government and the Taiwanese government, between American companies and Taiwanese companies, between American civil society and Taiwanese civil society. We should also be looking to multilateralize these efforts and encourage other countries that see the world in much the same way and that recognize the value of liberal democracy in Taiwan to follow America's lead and deepen their bilateral ties, political, economic, cultural, and otherwise. The United States also, and our like-minded partners also, should be looking for ways to install Taiwan more completely into global multilateral bodies. And in this respect, a tip of the hat to the Biden administration for including Taiwan in the Summit of Democracies, which kicks off today. That's a very important effort, as evidenced by the fact that the Chinese Communist Party has worked itself up into hysterics to denounce the Biden administration's wise and prudent measure here. The Trump administration attempted something similar in trying to get Taiwan involved in WHO efforts to control and mitigate the spread of COVID. And again, we saw a hysterical reaction from Beijing, which seems to me to suggest that we're on the right path in these efforts. And then a third, an important component to these multilateral efforts is for the democracies of the world to show solidarity with one another. Efforts to promote Taiwanese democracy, to include Taiwan in multilateral bodies, inevitably will produce economic and other forms of retaliation from China. Countries that face these sorts of repercussions should not have to face them alone. We need to ensure solidarity between like-minded countries as a way of deterring overreaction from Beijing. And I think we can probably talk in more detail about the specifics of what that could look like as we get into the Q&A. Finally, let me talk about some of the military and assistance measures that are needed to help shore up Taiwanese democracy. Of course, the principal threat to Taiwanese democracy is not an abstract principle of autocracy. It's the People's Liberation Army coming across the Taiwan Strait in an invasion. The United States and our like-minded partners need to do whatever we can to deter China from making such a rash decision as to try and exterminate Taiwanese democracy by force. What that means in practice is the provision of systems to pursue an anti-access or area denial strategy for Taiwan. Basically, weapon systems capable of defeating across strait invasion, anti-ship weapons, anti-aircraft weapons. What that doesn't mean is heavy investments in what we might call prestige weapon systems, flashy F-16 fighter jets that are fun to fly, but that don't bring the same deterrent effect when it comes to their stopping power for a cross-strait invasion. I'll stop there. I think we have plenty to discuss, and I look forward to hearing the contributions from my co-panelists and a robust Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sales. Those 3 points are excellent points, and I particularly resonate with your point about the rejuvenation was accomplished through Taiwan's liberal democracy. How would it be if the mainland Chinese people could hear this and aspire the same thing? We could talk about your rest of points that you made after the opening remarks by the other 2 panelists. Now we move on to Dr. Karis Templeman. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to join this distinguished panel. I think my job here today is, at least in my formal remarks, to try to place Taiwan's democracy in a comparative context. And bottom line up front, Taiwan is a very resilient, robust democracy. It's really impressive just how high it scores on all of the comparative indices out there that try to measure various aspects of democracy. And it's also an exception to the trend we see across the world in terms of democratic decline. So Taiwan is a third wave democracy. It didn't really become a full democracy until 1996. So it's fairly young. And if we look at all the other third wave democracies, there's only 1 or 2 that now score at similar levels to Taiwan. Chile, the Baltics, perhaps Uruguay, and that's about it. Every other country has experienced some significant backsliding over the last few years. So part of the motivation for the Biden summit was actually to put the spotlight on this democratic recession. We're now at the point where we might call it democratic depression. And Taiwan actually offers a kind of a shining light on the hill, some rays of hope here in what's generally a pretty dismal picture. So if I go through these democratic indices, Taiwan under Freedom House ratings scores a 94 out of 100. That's second in Asia behind Japan. It's well above South Korea, which is next at 83. If you don't like Freedom House, the Brits have their own indices. The Economist Intelligence Unit scores all the countries in the world as well on a 10-point scale. Taiwan is now at an 8.94 out of 10. That's well above Japan at 8.13 and South Korea at 8.01. If you don't like the Anglo-Saxon world, there's something called the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, which measures the kind of combined economic, social, and democratic performance of countries. that index puts Taiwan third in the world among all of the non-old Western democracies, above all but Uruguay and Estonia. And so Taiwan really stands out. And if you don't like any of those, my favorite indice is a bit more complex. It's the Varieties of Democracy Index. And on that, Taiwan actually scores quite well as well today. And so this is really quite remarkable. Taiwan is a real outlier on the positive end. It's remarkable for a country that is unrecognized by most of the world. It's remarkable for a country that is deeply interconnected with the People's Republic of China, which is now the world's foremost authoritarian power. And it's just, given where Taiwan was even 10 or 15 years ago, they've moved in a very positive direction. Political polarization is down, worries about tampering elections, vote buying, that sort of thing. Those are mostly in the past. Taiwan's legal system continues to strengthen. And so they're doing a lot of things right. And so I do think I commend the organizers of this panel for kind of putting the spotlight on Taiwan and asking, what can we learn from Taiwan that might be relevant to a lot of other countries struggling with some of the same problems? So the second thing I'd like to talk about is sources of resiliency, of democratic resiliency in Taiwan. And some of these are replicable in other countries, some not. Taiwan did have the fortune of inheriting a pretty high capacity state before it transitioned to democracy. So the Kuomintang regime, although it was autocratic, also had a monopoly on violence well before the transition to multi-party democracy. Also, rather remarkably, put in place a very high-performing, transparent, efficient, and low-tech system of election management. And so elections in Taiwan today are very, very well run. Much better run than those in my own country, the United States. And so I think a lot of countries could learn a lot about increasing the confidence in and the legitimacy of elections from the way Taiwan runs them. Taiwan also has a bit of it conforms to a kind of modernization story where there was during the transition to democracy, a highly educated population, a relatively equal distribution of income, a large middle class. All of those things, I think, have helped Taiwan's democratic resiliency over the long run. But there's also, I think, a hidden factor, and that is Taiwan's party system is quite institutionalized. So it has two major political parties. The same two parties that were leading the country in the 1990s are the two main competitors today, the KMT and the DPP. And that actually, if we look at where democracies have backslid, it's often been because of the collapse of the party system. There's a collapse of an opposition that leads to a decline in accountability, that leads to one party kind of seizing everything and taking over the state. In Taiwan, we haven't really seen that. And so that has been kind of a hidden, I think, benefit of the persistence of some of these pre-democratic legacies into the democratic era. And then finally, we can get into this more in the Q&A, but I think there's an ironic factor here in that China's own pressure on Taiwan has actually strengthened Taiwan's democratic resiliency. So I like to use the analogy of growing up with an endemic disease. So Taiwan had this China threat hanging over it from its first day as a democracy, and so it developed a sort of democratic antibodies to the China threat. And so it's actually been quite adaptable and quite resilient in the face of concerted pressure campaigns. There's freewheeling media. There's a great deal of skepticism about messaging coming out of China. They share a similar language and culture, and ironically, that means it's easier in some ways to identify CCP influence in Taiwan and to call it out for what it is. And so overall, I think Taiwan has actually been very well positioned to fend off attempts by the CCP to undermine its democratic processes and legitimacy. So with that, I will stop my formal remarks and turn it over to the next speaker. Thanks.
Thanks, Karis. Thanks so much for highlighting the democratic resilience of Taiwan. And I do want to follow up with you later on external factors. I mean, you did go into the China factor a little bit toward the end, but there is also Hong Kong, and then its relationship with the US and other Western countries. We would love to hear more about how that has impacted Taiwan's democratic resilience and what that democratic resilience would look like when it gets transferred to as a lessons learned for other countries later. Now I will turn over to Dr. David Shulman. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Lynn. And thanks very much for having me. This is a fantastic topic to be addressing, and it's an honor to be on this panel. I'll try not to cover too much of what my excellent co-panelists have already covered, but we'll just jump in with a few points. First, I think it's really important to underscore that there has been a lot of progress in terms of expanding Taiwan's international space just in the last couple of years. I think, support for Taiwan's democracy and its continued survival in the face of China's threats, its coercion, its interference, has in many ways become synonymous with support for democratic and universal values globally and opposition to China's promotion of authoritarianism. And with China now more clearly becoming a totalitarian state under Xi Jinping, with PRC actions and rhetoric now routinely demonstrating its rights abuses are not constrained by national borders, and the CCP regime is a problem not just for the Chinese people, but for all open societies, there's now a growing consensus among developed democracies that China is a systemic rival, that opposes a challenge to democracy, and that Taiwan is clearly the democracy most at risk of subversion by China. And that, along with the clear importance now of the Indo-Pacific and Taiwan in particular to the global economy, has raised for many countries the importance of protecting Taiwan as an independent democracy, and has almost made support for Taiwan a sort of litmus test among many officials looking to prove that they will stand up for global democracy and universal values at a time when both are, as we all know, under duress. And so democracies around the world that had long walked on eggshells to avoid angering China are expanding long ignored relationships with Taiwan. And so we have seemingly weekly motions now by democratic governments in Europe, especially parliamentary bodies, calling for closer ties with Taiwan and support for its democracy and its international space, not just in Eastern Europe and the Baltics, where we've seen a lot of this, but also seeing more action out of Western Europe. And as others have mentioned, this week we have Taiwan represented at the Summit of Democracies in the US. Again, a very important step for Taiwan's international participation that underscores the importance of Taiwan's democracy at a time when China is amplifying narrative efforts to paint so-called Western democracy as an effort by the US and others to force sovereign countries to adapt and adopt our way of doing things, and to confuse the very meaning of democracy and pushing these laughable notions of whole process democracy in China and so on. And so this is all to the good, but it leads to my second point, which is there's a lot that needs to be done and still remains to be done. There's a need to go beyond these important visits and these statements now that more developed democracies are getting behind Taiwan as a symbol of democracy, to actually deepen institutional links with Taiwan, to take concrete steps towards advocating for Taiwan's role in multilateral institutions at the risk of full-on PRC economic punishment, and also helping to bolster Taiwan's resilience to China's coercion and interference, particularly in the economic domain. So I think importantly, we have seen some diplomatic support for Taiwan as a democracy and an international player start to extend a support for Taiwan as an economic partner, which really is critical for its ability to fend off China's aggression and play the more fulsome global role that it should. And so Taiwan and the United States recently had the second session of an economic dialogue launched last year. And the two did finally hold TIFA talks, trade investment framework agreement talks last summer. But of course, Taiwan hopes for progress on a free trade agreement with the US. In Europe, we've seen numerous individual European countries indicate greater interest in deepening economic ties with Taiwan. The EU's new Indo-Pacific strategy identifies the need to deepen trade investment with Taiwan. So all of this is taking a little longer than one might hope, but these are critical steps if you step back and look at what the state of affairs a few years ago. And they underscore the reduced effect of China's threatened economic retaliation on Taiwan's potential partners. And secondly, and arguably most importantly, they have the potential to help reduce Taiwan's dependence on China economically, which has long been a key vulnerability and is critical to Taiwan's sovereignty and its survival. And finally, on this point, there's been a lot of talk about how democratic countries can join forces to ensure that countries subject to China's coercion, like Lithuania, like Australia, are offered support, and thereby reducing the costs and the deterrent effects of China's threats on other countries considering taking a stand on issues around human rights or on Taiwan. And we saw this week the EU propose a new anti-coercion instrument and pointedly link it to China's new measures against Lithuania. So this is all good, but it's important to note that despite all this progress, we still have Taiwan's exposure to China's economic coercion, and that remains extreme, and it's a potent risk to its democracy. And so if the US and its allies can't support Taiwan economically and forge things such as an FTA or EU expansion of trade with Taiwan, it does not bode well, I would say, for a broader mutual pact against CCP economic aggression and coercion. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about lessons that Taiwan can share globally, which both helps other democracies, but also helps Taiwan to expand its international space at the same time. As most will know, Taiwan unfortunately has decades of experience with China's aggression, not just in terms of overt threats and diplomatic and military and economic coercion, but also in terms of interference in its internal politics and democracy. And Taiwan really is the signal example of how pervasive Chinese Communist Party interference in a democracy can be, and how China's tactics can target democracy's very foundations, and also, most importantly, how that interference can be identified and exposed and countered. So other countries can learn from what Taiwan has gone through. And there are many lessons that I won't go through right now, which were learned from Taiwan's 2018 midterm elections regarding CCP information operations, some of which were applied successfully to defend against those same measures in the 2020 presidential election. The Taiwan government was very responsive to disinformation. They set up a task force. They worked with platforms like Facebook and Line. They used legal remedies to protect against misinformation. But you also had a very active civil society sector doing a lot of work monitoring disinformation, training people to spot it. And these kind of elements are things that people can learn from. These groups are on the leading edge of this work to counter CCP disinformation globally. And as we talk about Taiwan's international space, I think we should view this civil society sector, Taiwan's NGOs and research community, as a key element of this engagement. It's a really critical way for Taiwan to share its experiences and develop networks of connections, which helps countries newer to China's tactics, especially in the global South, preemptively build resilience against mounting Chinese Communist Party influence and information operations. Taiwan can also play a bigger role in countering CCP coercion and attempted co-optation of Chinese diaspora groups globally, including by supporting independent Chinese language media and resources. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the discussion, perhaps. And my last point here is that the world can learn from Taiwan, not only because of its experience protecting democracy in the face of authoritarian interference, but also because of the fact that, and Karis talked about this a little bit as well, it's doing democracy well at a time when some, not just in China, are questioning whether democracies can even deliver on big things like health and security. And in particular, Taiwan's leading the way in employing technology to be more responsive to citizen demands, to address critical issues like an emerging pandemic or security concerns, without employing the sort of digital authoritarian tools, the sort of surveillance and monitoring, the sort of burgeoning social credit system that China is instituting and sharing worldwide. And I think Taiwan can help inform at a very granular level the developmental agendas of countries throughout the global South, especially regarding digital connectivity and cybersecurity, in ways that bolster future democratic resilience and help them build the institutions and foundation for future economies that are not dependent on China's manufactured tech, on its training, on its financing, and approaches to governance that prioritize accountability and transparency. And this type of more working level engagement between Taiwan and other countries can be done without raising official complications about one China or implying countries that are reliant on China economically must decouple from the PRC. And so in doing this, you have Taiwan simultaneously putting the lie to China's narratives regarding democracy's failings, while also at the same time expanding its international space. So I'm glad to see the US and US funded organizations actively supporting this. So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, David. And as you were talking, I was just thinking about how when you were at IRI and started the China's Influence Project, I don't remember, it was 4 or 5 years ago, and how far we have come and how much progress we have made that we can actually talk about this very openly without any apologetic tone whatsoever that we had to take several years ago. So I agree with you that we have come a long way, and now we can talk about Taiwan's inclusion in these multilateral mechanisms or initiatives, as well as the fact that Taiwan was invited to this Summit for Democracy just seemed natural rather than something that we had to debate over if this were to happen many years ago. But at this, so I want to start from there. So we made a lot of progress, and now we can talk about, at least debate with one another about the possibility of including Taiwan into multilateral initiatives or building solidarity for Taiwan. And despite that, we've been talking about this a lot, and this is based on my own experience just in the last few months. There is still very strong hesitation to include Taiwan in a very open way, especially these established multilateral initiatives that exist to protect human rights and democracy around the world. So given your background and experience, if we were to sort of think about some concrete steps that US allies and partners can do to make this happen, what needs to happen first? I mean, we could talk about this, but what are some of the concrete ways to make this happen so that in the next couple of years, we see Taiwan being plugged into more of these multilateral initiatives and be recognized as a solid democracy player alongside our European, North American, other democracy partners around the world? So I want to pose this question to all three panelists. And I don't know, David, I see you on my screen, so I'm going to ask you to give this a shot, and then I will turn to Ambassador Sales and Karis.
Sure, thanks. I can kick it off. I think, as I said, I think there is real progress that we're seeing in terms of, the fact that you have more and more countries willing to engage with Taiwan on a bilateral basis, and also have more institutional links. That kind of sets the foundation for more of a strength in numbers in terms of more united and increasing routine efforts among these countries that are willing to risk, China's tongue lashing and punitive actions. And so that sets, I think, an important foundation to then bring Taiwan more into these organizations. I think we need to kind of start and understand and have a realistic view of what's going to happen in the initial phases. I think there's a lot of ways in which, we should continue to make the case, the US and other developed democracies, about Taiwan's participation in UN bodies, in ICAO, in the WHO, in these organizations where it clearly ought to be there. And it clearly, the fact that it's excluded is a risk to global safety and health. But I think we also shouldn't see Taiwan's participation at the UN or its specialized agencies as the be all and end all of Taiwan's inclusion in global affairs. And so in the meantime, there are other ways in which, kind of in ad hoc multilateral groupings and in engagements, the international community can bring Taiwan in and benefit from its experience. And so I'm thinking in part of things like the Global Cooperation and Training Framework that the United States has with Taiwan, which facilitates multilateralism with Taiwan, free of Beijing's lobbying and vetoing. It brings together private sector and civil society. It brings together other governments. We've had engagement on that from the UK and from the Netherlands and Sweden, and I think others. And there's plans to expand it. So that's kind of a way to make sure that Taiwan's getting more engaged in these multilateral conversations and sharing its knowledge and experience. And then lastly, I'll say, and I kind of touched on this a little bit, the developing world is a little bit of a different beast. And I think it's very important in this regard. And China, has always made a lot of its supposed leadership of the developing world. And that's something that we're seeing even more of in the last year or so, pushing its new development concept and all of these things. And so I think China has a sense that the level of engagement and, to be frank, the level of economic dependence that a lot of countries in the global south have on China will make it difficult for there to be a groundswell in terms of majority of numbers to welcome Taiwan into UN bodies and multilateral institutions. And so I think at least the work needs to be started to help to reduce that level of dependence that a lot of these countries have, and that China truly seeks to deepen across much of the global south. That's a much broader conversation, but I think it's important to recognize that because the developing world makes up most of international institutions just by numbers, and so that's another important aspect of this.
Great, thanks. I do want to come back to the economic coercion by Chinese, especially in these developing countries. So we'll come back to that. Thanks. Ambassador Sales?
Thanks. I don't really have much to add to what David just said because I think he was spot on. I guess I'd make one or maybe 1.5 points to supplement his observations. So in addition to the global/UN type multilateral bodies, I think there's also value in including Taiwan in smaller multilateral efforts, regional efforts, or subject matter efforts. So, today's Summit of the Democracies is a great example of this. Multilateral bodies that the United States leads or that China lacks veto power over, so outside the UN context, there's, I think, enormous value in the United States using its convening power to assemble regional states, Pacific states, or like-minded states on various subject matters, as we're seeing today. And it doesn't just have to be subject matter related organizations that have to do with politics. It could be economic matters, Lynn, to sort of anticipate one of the points that you just put on the table. Whatever successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership emerges, something like that is an ideal platform for Taiwan to be better integrated into the architecture of the region's economy and trading relationships. And then the last point I would make, and this is my half observation, is why does it matter, right? Why does it matter to integrate Taiwan more into global and multilateral and bilateral bodies or initiatives? I think, first of all, it adds to Taiwan's legitimacy. The more bodies that Taiwan participates in, either as a de jure or de facto member, the more other countries are accustomed to thinking of Taiwan as a normal nation that is part of the club. And then the second reason, I think, is because it gives those countries a stake in Taiwan's continued success. As more and more countries come to engage with and benefit from Taiwan's expertise and Taiwan's economic worthiness, shall we say, those countries have a greater stake in seeing that Taiwan continues to exist as a vibrant liberal democracy and prospective trading partner.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sales. I do have a follow-up question, but I'm going to ask Karis to go, and then I'll come back to you. And please go ahead.
Okay. So I just have a couple of things to add to my colleagues' comments. One is someone who has specialized mostly in the study of Taiwan politics over the last decade. There has been, from my perspective, just a tremendous sea change in how people in the US foreign policy community think about Taiwan. So 10 years ago, Taiwan was a problem, an irritant, something to be minimized in the US-China relationship, and something like the less noise Taiwan, better. And our relationship with China was just seen as much more complex and important, and anything that Taiwan did to get in the way was a problem for us. Now it's completely flipped. We're back in the position of seeing Taiwan as kind of on the front lines of I don't want to use the word Cold War mentality, but it's on front lines of this struggle against authoritarianism again. And so it's a much more there's much more appreciation now for Taiwan and a much more willingness to challenge the CCP talking points about Taiwan and our own one China policy and so forth. And so that's been encouraging to me. The other point I'd make here on the question, why does Taiwan matter? I also think Taiwan is a kind of canary in the coal mine in international institutions. So if Taiwanese representatives have no access to an international institution, that indicates that that institution is under PRC influence, right? So it's not really about Taiwan as much as it is competing with the PRC for influence in these international institutions. So if we can find other ways, other ad hoc groupings, other regional or multilateral institutions to work through that allow Taiwan in them also has the advantage of a minimal, if non-existent, PRC influence in those institutions. And so Taiwan is basically a test case for whether we can combat rising PRC influence in international institutions. Finally, I'd just like to add one big problem in a lot of countries engaging with Taiwan is that they recognize the People's Republic of China. And in order to do that, they had to break off formal relations with the Republic of China on Taiwan. And to get around that, we're seeing more and more countries engaging in not state-to-state level relations, but some kind of civil society to civil society relations or academic exchanges, or interestingly, recently, there have been several parliamentary bodies that have sent delegates to Taiwan on a parliament-to-parliament level. And Taiwan actually has kind of reappropriated the concept from the CPP in their conversations with the KMT. They've engaged in DPP to LP conversations with Japan. And so they've got creative ways to get around non-mutual recognition. And I hope that continues and that we can find ways to support that. So to take this to the US, having congressional delegations visit the Li Fa-Yuan in Taipei, I think is a great way to deepen those kinds of interactions without violating our own One China policy.
Thanks, Karis. So my follow-up question is also for all of you, and something that Ambassador Sales said that triggered, and Karis, you also touched up on this a little bit. So I think we have made a lot of progress on the Taiwan front, and more countries are interested in engaging with Taiwan or including Taiwan in their regional or subject matter initiatives or coalitions. But at the same time, the biggest resistance on engaging with Taiwan perhaps comes from the Indo-Pacific. So I just want to pose this question to all of you. The US, I think it's really great for the US to continue to engage Taiwan and include them on US-led initiatives or when the US has a convening power. But at the same time, how do we also help ensure that Taiwan does have that similar support from the Indo-Pacific region where they are based in? And I would love to hear your thoughts on this issue. This is something that I also struggle with as we engage with Taiwan to have more democratic buy-in in the region so that they can step up and actually show off their democracy as a model for other countries. But Taiwan is often met with a resistance. I think Taiwan has made some progress on civil society to civil society interaction, as Karis mentioned, but at the government level, there is still some sensitivity, and the biggest challenge is China. These countries have to maintain their relationship with China for economic and security reasons. So how can Taiwan go about establishing solid relationships with their neighbors?
Let me take a quick stab at that and answer at least part of the question. I think you start with your like-minded partners in the region and build out from there. You start with a Quad, for instance. One specific thing that we could envision is the next time there's a ministerial meeting or a summit level meeting of the Quad members, the US, Australia, Japan, and India, maybe some observers get invited. Maybe Taiwan makes the cut. The next time we have an event in Tokyo or in Delhi. Maybe ASEAN or East Asia Summit looks for ways to get Taiwan involved. That of course is much more complicated with China playing a role in those organizations. So that would have to be aspirational at this point. But you could look for ways to build towards that over the next 2 to 5 years. But I think starting with like-minded countries to normalize the principle of Taiwan's involvement and then build out from there while showing solidarity with some of those regional partners that are wary of risking Beijing's ire. That's what's really driving this, right? They fear that if they engage with Taiwan in the way the United States does, they're not going to have sufficient economic or diplomatic clout to resist the inevitable backlash that would trigger. We can reduce the costs to those regional players by standing in solidarity with them. And again, this is part of another conversation that we're going to have later on during the Q&A, what solidarity looks like, what that means. But I think that's one thing we could do as we sort of broaden out from the core of the Quad to try and get additional countries to follow the United States lead by showing them that we will have their back in the event that Beijing retaliates economically or otherwise.
Okay, thank you. David or Karis?
Sure, I can just add one thing, and that is the pressure on each of these countries from the PRC is only effective if they think they're being singled out, and so there's basically a collective action problem here. If you get all of the countries who kind of herd in the same direction and they all support inviting Taiwan, and the PRC cannot single out every other country in the Indo-Pacific, right? And so the more countries you can get on board with an initiative to include Taiwan in a conversation, the more diffuse the potential costs that the PRC imposes, and the less retaliatory, the less impact those costs will have. And so I do think the U.S. has an important role to play here as kind of leading the collective action that needs to happen in order to include Taiwan in these things.
David?
Not much to add beyond what Ambassador Sales and Dr. Templeman have said. I would just add, I think, yes, like-minded countries, and I think the Quad or Quad plus, Korea or some other, framings make sense. I think we could also think about it doesn't necessarily just have to be about democracies in East Asia. Sometimes, you're going to want to engage potentially countries that have been on the sharp end of China's stick, like Vietnam, that are not democracies going forward. So I think that's just one additional thing to note. And then, ASEAN will be very difficult. I think it's important to recognize the differences between the kind of groupings we're talking about and certain countries in Southeast Asia that are not going to be, especially in mainland Southeast Asia, that are just not going to be moving on these issues for a very long time, if ever. But there are places to start, as has been said, with different groupings, with leveraging Taiwan's new southbound policy, which I think has been invigorated in the last couple of years. And there is progress to be made, but I think we just have to be realistic about which institutional groupings can be worked through. Try not to think of it necessarily as a democracy versus authoritarianism thing when that's not going to work, to make it a Manichaean either or in Southeast Asia in particular, and to leverage the work that Taiwan's already doing.
Great, thanks. So because we also talked about democratic solidarity and economic coercion a little bit, so I want to move on to that conversation a little bit. So I think, David, like to your point, why should Taiwan just limit themselves to the Indo-Pacific neighbors? They should branch out to other European countries and whatnot. And that's an effort that they've been making in the last few years to build democratic solidarity around Taiwan. But I mean, we use that Lithuania as an example. You used that example earlier, Lithuania trying to establish a representative office, Taiwan to allow Taiwan to establish a representative office in Lithuania, and they were punished for it. And Australia is another case which, David, you're very familiar with, a lot of influence operation happening, a lot of economic pressure. So there's almost a fear, a hesitation on engaging with Taiwan because of the fear of economic repercussions. And so just sort of thinking about solidarity building around Taiwan, how do we also think about solidarity building, not just around Taiwan, but then also for countries who want to engage with Taiwan because they're like-minded countries? And how do we reduce, and I think Ambassador Sales, you also talked about, how do we reduce or make sure that the cost of doing business in Taiwan is not going to be detrimental to these countries? So, and I think it's an important question because it does come up over and over. And some of these East Asian countries, they do have to think about the fact that, tension between China and these countries could cost significantly on the economic front. So how do we think about solidarity in a way that is going to also reduce the cost of engagement with Taiwan?
I can start. I think, this is like, I think the fundamental question. We're talking about Taiwan today, and I think it clearly relates to Taiwan in this context, but it's also, we've had kind of a merging of the subject of, countries that, like Lithuania, have taken brave moves in terms of their relationship with Taiwan and risking incurring China's wrath. But it relates to any country at this point who wants to speak out about what's happening in Xinjiang or about what's happening in Hong Kong, or just kind of talking about China's role in the world and how to make sure that it doesn't undermine the liberal order and open societies. And so I think that's why for the reasons of Taiwan itself, but also for this broader principle of how are we going to engage and deal with a China that is rising and becoming soon to be, in the next arguably 10 to 15 years, the world's biggest economy, led by a government that's going more in a totalitarian direction and shaping our global order and shaping society. So I think thinking through now how to deal with what China's doing, for instance, with a little country with Lithuania, has really important implications. And so we've seen it's not just what we've seen from China typically, and some of the economic coercion tools we've seen in Australia in the last couple of years, a year especially. But we've seen even recently in this week, it looks like China's going to be pressuring multinational corporations not to engage with Lithuanian companies and in Lithuania. And I think pushing back collectively on those kind of tactics and making it clear that that's not acceptable is really critical. And the key is how do you do that? EU, as I mentioned, has this new mooted anti-coercion instrument that theoretically would punish or push back on China for using economic coercion tools. I think that's certainly a good start. And I think that there needs to be also some more discussion about how to protect fellow democracies when China does use those punitive economic measures, not just to punish China, but to protect and to give a sense that, and as you said, Lynn, kind of to get a sense that China's deterrent kind of fear mongering is not going to work, because countries know that if this happens to them, their economies won't be put in the tank because of what China does. One last point on this, I think, is especially with the Australia example, it's really important for developed democracies, especially at this point, to be having conversations about, okay, when China does this, undertakes these economic punitive measures against countries where China still has needs in that trading relationship, and in the Australia case, still has imports from Australia that it would need to receive even after it cuts off that trading relationship, that when that happens, the United States or European countries or others aren't going to swoop in and take over that market from Australia in a way that means that we really don't have any kind of solidarity on these issues, despite the nice rhetoric that we might be saying about how we all stand with Australia. So thinking through how we're going to deal with those issues and how we're going to make sure that China can't, do these sorts of things to Australia without harming itself and without getting the sorts of imports, for instance, of iron ore that it needs, and that it can get it from somewhere else.
Okay, great, thanks. Ambassador Sales or Karis? Ambassador Sales, go ahead.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I think David's observations are spot on. The thing to keep in mind here is that although China will soon have the world's largest GDP, that number is dwarfed by the combined GDPs of the United States and our like-minded partners. When you add the American economy to that of Europe and to that of Japan and Australia, and if we're even more ambitious and include India into the schemes or mechanisms we might be contemplating here, we have an enormous amount of economic leverage over Beijing that dwarfs Beijing's economic leverage over us collectively. And so we should be prepared to use our economic leverage to protect members of our group that Beijing targets. And there are various different kinds of retaliatory measures that Beijing might unleash, cutting off trade, as we've seen in Lithuania, as we've seen with Australian beef. And I think wine too, and that really is cutting off your nose to spite your face if you're going to give up Barossa Valley Shiraz in order to drink Great Wall Red. Yeah. So another form of economic coercion we might see is in developing countries. China might cut off development assistance, stop funding infrastructure projects, and so on. So in both of those cases, the combined economic might of the United States and our like-minded partners positions us very, very well to come in behind China and supply the need that China has withdrawn, whether it's consumer goods or whether it's mobilizing our collective private sectors through things like the Development Finance Corporation to provide the kinds of development assistance or infrastructure development that China has withdrawn from a developing country. There will be costs, to be sure, but I think pooling those risks and spreading the costs across a group of like-minded countries plays to our comparative advantages and puts Beijing in a position of being isolated and subject to greater economic leverage than would be the case if China tries to play divide and conquer and pick off individual countries and subjecting them to coercive measures on its own. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate your wine analogy because I happen to be a wine connoisseur, so thank you for that. Karis?
Sure. I just want to add one thing, and that is the United States right now is not really leading on maintaining or expanding a rules-based order for trade and economic interaction, right? The fact that we pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think, was incredibly damaging to our standing in the region, and we're still suffering from the reputational consequences of that today. The Chinese have actually applied to get into the successor to that, the CPTPP, and so has Taiwan. We have not. And so I think if we want to be able to push back systematically against this repeated pattern of PRC use of economic leverage as political coercion, we need to be in a position to offer an alternative that looks better to all the other countries. And right now, we're just not in that position. And so I think we've got to do our homework as well and get our act together.
Thank you. So, I mean, we could go on about these issues in terms of concrete examples, but I will come back to that. While I have you, Karis, on a screen, I do want us to shift our conversation a little bit to lessons learned and sharing of some of the examples of Taiwan's democratic resilience. You mentioned earlier about some of the sources of success of democratic resilience in Taiwan, but I wanted to ask you and perhaps David and Ambassador Sales, the role that external influences. So if we're talking about China, China's influence in Taiwan, but how China has also played a role in ensuring that these democratic norms and values, or at least the Taiwanese people, are committed to these norms and values. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit, and then how that can be a lesson learned for other similar like-minded countries in other parts of the world, and also want to touch up on Taiwan's role in countering disinformation and promoting digital economy more broadly across the world. And what are some concrete ways that Taiwan can play that role given their success on this front? So I will start with Karis, and then I will turn to David and Ambassador Sales.
Okay. So that's a lot to bite off there. Let me just take a part of it. And I'll allow my colleagues to supplement everything that I missed. I think one of the Well, of the things that really helped Taiwan in the face of PRC coercion and attempts to erode its democracy, there are three big things. One is actually media freedom. Taiwan has a really freewheeling media environment, and so there is open reporting on PRC intervention in Taiwanese elections. There's often speculative reporting about PRC funneling money to certain candidates, and those are very salient issues in Taiwanese politics, simply because the China question is so central to Taiwanese elections. And so the fact that there's a freewheeling media environment, I think in some ways it's a vulnerability, but in other ways it really has helped counter some of the more traditional PRC tactics where they try to buy out certain media outlets that and shift their line in a way that's in a pro-Beijing direction. They've attempted that with several media outlets in Taiwan, and it quickly became obvious who was kind of directing the coverage in those outlets, and that they were favorable to Beijing's line. And so the majority of the electorate quickly became very, very skeptical of reporting from those outlets. So that's been one source of democratic resiliency in Taiwan. Another is Taiwan's civil society. It's quite fragmented, but it's also quite lively. There's a lot of smart, well-connected people who understand how operations work, who are well-connected at the grassroots to individual candidates or parties, and who can highlight threats. So the government is not the sole actor trying to combat disinformation in Taiwan. There's also independent academic or non-governmental organizations who are also working hard at this. And then the third is the Taiwanese government has actually, over the last 4 years, and especially the last two, since, well, I guess it should say three now, since 2018, the ruling party has really pushed to create a more robust legal foundation for monitoring foreign agents operating in Taiwan. So they've passed some legislation that requires news media outlets to identify their ownership. They've passed legislation requiring foreign agents to register, and they've tried to increase the transparency of money being donated to political campaigns. And I think most importantly, the judiciary has, well, I should say the prosecutoriate has stepped up its an investigation of United Front activities in Taiwan, and has actually, I think, done a pretty good job of capturing or at least identifying the biggest threats to Taiwan democracy. And so those three things, I think, have really helped support Taiwan's resiliency in the face of the CCP influence campaign.
Great, thanks, Karis.
I can add to that. I mean, I think Karis did a great job covering some of the main things I would have hit, especially media freedom and transparency. And the legal landscape, foreign registration, being aware of what's happening in the media space, being aware of what's happening in the academic and research domain, some of these investigations. These are things that are really at the foundation for helping countries to become more resilient to foreign authoritarian influence. And Taiwan, of course, has been going through this for a very long time. So they have, unfortunately, some experience with it, but they also are really at the forefront of responding to it and can use that experience to share with others. I would just add a couple things. One, Taiwan has experienced not just the things that Karis was laying out, but really the full gamut of influence in a way that I think a lot of developed countries, other developed democracies and developing countries are starting to wrestle with, including the economic interdependence between Taiwan and the PRC and the impact that has on really being able to investigate and pull apart the level of influence that the PRC has in a country. That's something that really is at the heart of making sure that our democracies and open societies are truly more resilient against what China is trying to do, not just in the United Front domain, but just by kind of using captured elites to kind of think of China's interests first before they think of the interests of their own citizens. So I think that's an aspect of this. And then in the disinformation domain specifically, again, Karis touched on this a little bit, that you had the government, especially after 2018, really, focusing in on this, having I think, Lynn, maybe you mentioned Audrey Tang, having a digital minister focused on this, really coming up with a process for identifying disinformation, responding to it quickly, responding it to in an effective way that gets people's attention. So that's been really effective. But I think beyond that, the role of civil society in Taiwan can't be underestimated. And I think it's not just, in terms of civil society's role in exposing China's disinformation, but it's really in terms of, and we talked about this a little bit before, really, setting up Taiwan as a really effective digital democracy at the same time as China is going in this direction of the model of digital authoritarianism. And so you have in Taiwan a really, compared to most, a radically transparent government. You have publicly viewable government sessions, publicly available digital data on voting records and budgets, or at least they're going in that direction. Digital infrastructure to enable everyday citizens to propose and express opinions on policies. And you have this civic tech community, which has really been key to Taiwan's success in building that digital democracy. And this has been especially apparent during COVID, when you had contact tracing and fact checking bots and crowdsourcing policies that really helped Taiwan be a leader in thinking through how a democracy can effectively deal with COVID. And so I think Taiwan's leading away in terms of charting a course on balancing how does the government use technology and data while at the same time protecting privacy, limiting government overreach. These are fundamental questions that democracies are going to be wrestling with for decades to come. And I think Taiwan's really on the leading edge there.
Thank you so much, David. Ambassador Sales?
I think we've covered all the points I would have made. So we can move on, I think.
Okay, sounds good. So we actually have a question from the audience that may take some time for all three panelists to answer. So I want to move ahead and read this question out loud to you all. View of speakers on military aspects, including number one, is strategic ambiguity still a wise policy? Number two, building regional support for possibility of military assistance if Taiwan is attacked. For example, recent Japanese statement. And number three, dealing with PRC hybrid gray zone actions, which many think more likely than an outright cross-strait amphibious invasion or direct air attack. Ambassador, would you like to go first?
Boy, there's a lot there. And those are great questions. Maybe I'll focus on just the first part related to strategic ambiguity. Unfortunately, I don't think I've got a really good answer on this one. It's an enormously important, but also enormously difficult question. I guess the question is, to what extent would changing our policy of strategic ambiguity add to the deterrence we are trying to achieve against a cross-strait invasion? If I were still in government, that's the question I would want to know from the intelligence community and from regional experts. How is China likely to react if the United States changes its policy? And in particular, has China already priced into its cost-benefit analysis the likelihood that the United States would intervene militarily? If the answer is yes, do we really get that much more by changing our policy? If the answer is no, maybe we do gain something by changing our policy. But I think the fundamental point I would end with on this is, if the United States is going to threaten to come to the defense of Taiwan in the event of a military invasion, we'd better be prepared to do it, one, and we'd better be prepared to win, two. Anything else would be absolutely catastrophic, and indeed, perhaps even worse than the United States failing to intervene in the first place under our current approach of strategic ambiguity.
Thank you. David or Karis, would you like to answer some of these questions?
Sure, I can take on the strategic ambiguity question. This has come up a lot the last couple of years. There was actually a piece by Richard Haas and David Sachs in Foreign Affairs arguing for strategic clarity about a year ago. We actually hosted an event here at Stanford just a couple of months ago and had Haas as a keynote speaker, and even he was walking away from that strategic clarity position. And it turned out when we had conversations with a pretty broad section of experts on the Taiwan issue, the consensus was that strategic ambiguity still made a lot of sense. One of the reasons is there's still an entrapment problem here. To have strategic ambiguity is not only to keep Beijing guessing, but also to prevent Taipei from doing things that would entrap us in a conflict with China for things that are not in our fundamental interests. So it's not obvious. The current president of Taiwan is not going to do this, but it's possible in the future we could have a leader of Taiwan who less cognizant or less concerned about U.S. Sensitivities in this relationship and is willing to push provocative statements and to trigger a response from Beijing. And we don't want to enable that person to drag us into a conflict that we don't want to have. So that's part of the problem. The other is if we say exactly what we're going to do in a certain situation, then we give Beijing kind of carte blanche to do everything right up to that line. So strategic ambiguity is actually helpful in that it doesn't tie our hands as much. It keeps Beijing guessing a bit about where our own bottom line is. And the third point I'd make is I actually think the debate over strategic ambiguity is more and more beside the point. What matters now is less what we say and more what we do. So if we're engaging with Taiwan, if we demonstrate that Taiwan is of fundamental interest to the United States and that we would have to come to Taiwan's aid, even if we don't say that outright, if we sign a bilateral trade agreement, if, as is the case now, the vast majority of the most advanced semiconductor chips that we import come from Taiwan, and an invasion of Taiwan would cut us off from that source, those are credible signals that we would have to get involved in that conflict. And so there are lots of other ways to increase the credibility of a U.S. commitment to Taiwan without simply spelling it out in clear language to Beijing. And I think it's actually more effective to worry about all of the other practical aspects of the relationship than to worry about the kind of diplomatic language that we use in talking about our commitment to Taiwan.
All right, thank you. David?
I don't have too much more to add to what Ambassador Sales and Karis have put forward. I think I agree that the importance comes from the actions that we undertake, and I think the actual discussion and debate about strategic ambiguity has gone beyond its utility. And if we're demonstrating that, as Karis said, that the U.S. will come to Taiwan's aid in various ways, if we're making clear that that the U.S. will support Taiwan's ability to truly defend itself, and Ambassador Sales talked about this a little bit earlier in terms of those capabilities and what's needed to really make Taiwan that impregnable porcupine, or to go in that direction. I think that's really critical to do things like surprise, we're training Taiwan's military. These sorts of things that show that the United States really is committed to Taiwan and to its defense, I think are really critical. In addition to, as Karis said, other aspects like an FTA, like more and more official visits, I think really shows that there's been a change in the last couple of years. And I think in terms of the allies piece, obviously engaging Japan to the extent that Japan now is increasingly willing to talk about Taiwan and Taiwan's defense and the kind of the issue not being resolved militarily being critical to Japan's security. I think that's a big step, and the U.S. should continue to engage Japan on those issues, as well as other regional allies, and also talking to the Europeans about this as well. It's increasingly a subject in NATO conversations, and so I think that also at least sends a message, even if we don't expect our European allies to be kind of at the forefront of any military response if China were to invade Taiwan. And then gray zone tactics, we've talked about this a little bit. I mean, I think maybe this question is specific to the offshore islands and things like that. But I think when I think of gray zone tactics, I also very much, as I've discussed already, think of what China's trying to do and has long tried to do from the inside out to undermine Taiwan's democracy. And we're looking ahead to the 2024 presidential election. And I think everyone's expecting Taiwan to be subject to even more aggressive efforts of interference in Taiwan's political system. So watching that and watching what China's trying to do from that political interference perspective, and employing all the tools that it has to try to ensure that they get a more China-friendly administration in power in 2024 is something to watch closely.
Okay, thank you so much. While we're waiting for more questions from the audience, since this event is really embedded in the Summit for Democracy that is happening right now, I wanted to ask each panelist to spend a couple of minutes sort of reflecting on the Summit for Democracy and the year of action that will take place next year, and the second summit around this time, also next year. We've talked about lots of ways the US, its allies and partners can help Taiwan to be a global player in building democratic resilience, as well as for Taiwan to consider ways to strengthen their own democratic resilience. So in the spirit of Summit for Democracy, and we don't really have a full sense of exactly what Taiwan's pledges and commitments are. I guess we'll find out either today or tomorrow. But I was also told that just because they're making pledges today doesn't mean they cannot add or change during the year of action leading up to the second summit. So based on the conversations we had today, what are some of the things that you want to see happening during the year of action in the way that the US can play a role for Taiwan, and as well as for Taiwan to step up in certain aspects of strengthening democratic resilience? So if you could just spend a couple of minutes sort of reflecting on that, that would be wonderful. I would start with Ambassador Sales.
I was hoping I could go last so I could copy other people's ideas. That's another really big question. I think one piece of it is I'll echo something Kara said a little earlier, which is that the United States isn't really playing a leadership role when it comes to trade. That I think is one area that is ripe for American leadership during the year of action, using trade relationships and developing trade relationships to sort of supplement the political commitments that are going to be made at the summit. That can help put into place the architecture for the sort of collective self-defense approach to Chinese economic coercion. The stronger and the more robust those trade networks are, the easier it will be to mobilize them when needed to respond to Chinese economic coercion. So there's one idea for things. Now I understand that the domestic politics of this are complicated. There's a reason that both major party presidential candidates in 2016 said that they were not going to move forward with the TTP. And those domestic political concerns are not limited to the United States. There's always going to be domestic constituencies that are hurt by trade relationships, and they have very powerful reasons to make their voices heard in the context of a given country's domestic politics. So let's not be naive about how hard this will be. But I do think that American leadership on trade issues is one way to begin to put in place the architecture that's going to be needed for economic responses to Beijing's coercion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. David?
Yeah, I agree with everything Ambassador Sales said. I think, in terms of Taiwan's participation and engagement in the Year of Action, I think it should be as many different tracks, and they have these different tracks of the summit and tracks for action. Oh, am I still there?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay, I seem to freeze. That Taiwan's engaged on issues around, for instance, the legislative track on the importance of parliamentary engagement, and as Karis was saying, that there's more engagement with the legislative yuan in Taiwan on corruption issues, which are a key aspect of the Biden administration's approach to supporting democracy globally, and specifically a key aspect and focus of this summit. Taiwan obviously has its history of dealing with corruption issues and is kind of actively still dealing with this. So sharing those experiences in the same way that, and we've talked about, and I think Kara said, other democracies like the United States, like European democracies, are dealing with a whole host of different issues in terms of their health of their own democracies. Being honest about that, being honest about what Taiwan has successfully, or with some success, dealt with, I think is a really important way of contributing Taiwan's voice to the conversation. The media space, obviously, an important aspect as well. And as I said, in the context of a situation where you have Chinese language media around the world, and specifically in diaspora communities in Asia, but also further afield in places like Panama, where there are large diaspora communities. That's a big aspect of making sure that that there's access to information digitally as well on forums like WeChat. So I think Taiwan's role in making sure that there's an open, independent media space in different languages, and specifically in Chinese, is critical. And then I think I'd stop there, but I think all of those different aspects are really critical to Taiwan showing the way in terms of what it's learned. And I already talked a lot about the lessons that Taiwan can share about digital democracy, and also how it's handled COVID, which of course for much of the developing world is still rampant.
Okay, thanks so much, David. Karis?
Yeah, so all of that was great. I just want to supplement. I get to clean up here and cherry pick a couple of things. Actually, I just want to mention one thing, which is election administration in Taiwan. I already highlighted this earlier, but I do think Taiwan had a long tortured history of vote buying, of fraud, of kind of asymmetric application of law against candidates running for office during its authoritarian period. And it adapted its election management system to increase trust in the electoral process in a way that is now, I think, world-class. And I wish our own country would adopt some of their own practices. So the votes are counted at the polling place. They're counted publicly. Anybody who wants to come in and observe the count can do that. They count votes one at a time, holding them up so everybody in the room can see them. The votes are recorded on a sheet at the front of the room so that everybody can see votes have been cast for candidates. There's very clear procedures that are followed throughout the country of making sure that the ballots are all in the same place, that they're controlled until election day. And so there's a tremendous amount that I think can be learned from the Taiwan experience in terms of election administration. And I highlight this as an important aspect of Taiwan's democracy, because in 2020, this turned out to be critical in getting the losing camp to accept the results. I was pretty alarmed going into the 2020 election at how divergent the expectations were in the two camps about who would win. So the KMT candidate was far behind in the polls, but had a significant number of supporters who were absolutely convinced he was going to win on election day, just could not conceive of a loss in that election. And when the vote started rolling in, there was initially some, conspiracy theories and grumbling about how the DPP had rigged this election. But if you go to any polling place, and Taiwanese have done this now for decades, you can watch the vote come in, right? There's very little avenue for raising suspicions about the vote count. And so as a result, the losing candidate, even though many of his supporters were convinced he was going to win, gave a concession speech at the end and had no choice. All of the media, from the deep blue to the deep green to the red, all reported the results the same way. And so there was an acceptance of the result, and it legitimized the winner of that election. And our own democracy in the United States has had some trouble with this recently, to put it mildly. And so I think Taiwan in some ways does a lot better than most of the other democracies in the world because they've had this past experience and they've adapted to enhance the legitimacy of elections.
Thank you so much, Paris. It's almost 12:30, so we have to wrap up this panel discussion. It's been a fantastic discussion. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface because I think so many good points were raised by our respective panelists, and I apologize that we couldn't get into more concrete details about these issues that we discussed, but I hope that the Atlantic Council will continue to organize events like this so that we can continue this discussion and help Taiwan to continue to thrive as a democracy and make an important contribution to democratic resilience building around the world alongside with the US, its partners and allies. So thank you so much, David, Ambassador Sales and Karis and Atlantic Council and TECRO. And I will conclude this panel here. Thank you all.